Well, our final presenter is Dr. Travis Cruickshank from Edith, Cowan University in Western Australia. He's a neuroscientist and an exercise scientist and a researcher, and he is very committed to improving the quality of life of people. So please welcome Travis Cruickshank.
Okay, can everyone hear me?
Yes, good, thank you.
Perfect, I just wasn't sure there. First and foremost, thanks Julie for that warm introduction, and what a great job the Huntington's Disease Associations have done putting this together. They've done a terrific job, and a special thanks to Lewis, who's done a lot of work behind the scenes to get all the presentations in order. I'd like to thank the fellow presenters as well, who I think provided a really good overview of the recent drug studies, as well as some of the really exciting drug agents that are currently in testing. I'm going to take a little bit of a sidestep here and talk about lifestyle therapies, which is something that I'm very passionate about, and how it can help people to, I suppose, manage certain aspects of their disease. I'll explain why we're interested in it, some of the current studies that are running, some of the results that have already come out, and some of the areas of sort of interest to me as well as others within the field. All right, I'll get started. So just a little bit of a recap. So as you know, Huntington's disease is caused by this cytosine adenine guanine repeat expansion within the Huntington gene. And when you have the 40 or more of these CAG repeats, it actually leads to the disease. And the reason it does this is because this CAG expansion itself encodes for a mutant version of the Huntington protein. And this mutant version of the Huntington protein doesn't allow the cells within our brain to work quite properly. And this leads to a lot of the clinical issues that we see. So we know that the CAG expansion itself is linked to the age of onset of symptoms. And it accounts for about 60% of the variability in the age of onset. However, we also know that there are a number of other factors that are linked to this age of onset, including genetic modifiers or genetic factors, which is what Leora and Rachel were describing before. But there's also environmental factors that are also closely related to the age of onset of symptoms. But if you're interested in more in the genetic factors, then I've left the talk just down the bottom of my slide to a talk by Professor James Casella, who did a really good job about describing the genetic factors. So the influence of lifestyle factors on the onset and the progression of Huntington's disease is not a new concept. In fact, there's actually been a lot of case studies in monozygotic twins who actually share the same CAG repeat length and a very similar genetic makeup, and yet they still display a different age of onset of symptoms, and they show a different presentation of symptoms. And a lot of the early research in this space likened these or attributed these differences to these lifestyle factors. So they could be differences in work habits or differences in lifestyle behaviors and physical activity and so forth. And this is supported by a lot of observational research that has occurred in the field over the last sort of 20 years. I've only just put up a couple of these studies here, but these are some really relevant studies. So some research that was done by an Australian and New Zealand research team basically showed that people who were less physically active had an earlier age of onset of symptoms. And the people who were very physically active sometimes showed an earlier presentation by 4.6 years. Another study by the Predict study group, which is a very large consortium of researchers, and I'm sure some of the people who are listening here have been involved in this study. They found that people who had a higher level of education were involved in more complex occupations and had a higher IQ had a reduced rate of cognitive deterioration as well as a reduced rate of brain volume loss. And finally, some more recent work that we've done, and I will caution you because it's in a very small population of people, showed that people who were perhaps more aerobically fit and had a larger social network actually had lower levels of a protein called neurofilament-like protein. Now, this protein is actually suggested to be a biological marker of neurodegeneration. So this together, I suppose the main take-home message that you can deduce from this is that lifestyle factors, at least from this observational research, do appear to influence the onset and presentation of Huntington's disease. However, we still need a lot more work. There's been a lot of work in terms of the genetic modifiers, but not so much in terms of the environmental or lifestyle modifiers, and perhaps because of the difficulty in their actual measurement. However, with technology becoming more advanced and readily accessible, we're able to actually look at these lifestyle factors or lifestyle behaviors a little bit more closely. So one of the things that we really need, and I'll describe a study in a second that is working towards this, is we need to actually look at lifestyle behaviors on a more day-to-day basis and how that influences symptomatic fluctuations and also disease progression over time. Because if we can identify the lifestyle behaviors that are actually leading either to an earlier onset of symptoms or perhaps a more accelerated progression of symptoms, then we can start to design these targeted lifestyle-based approaches. So this slide was given to me by Professor Monica Busser, and Professor Monica Busser is actually running a brand new study called DOMINO-HD. And DOMINO-HD is aimed at looking at the influence of lifestyle factors along with other genetic factors and seeing which of these factors can actually be associated with disease progression. It's a very large study. It's running across 5 sites in Europe. And I suppose one of the interesting aspects of this study is that it's using these digital wearables to actually look at lifestyle behaviors. So actually they're looking at Fitbits, to be honest, and they should provide a really good estimation of physical activity as well as sleep-wake behaviors. There's some other digital technology that they're using to look at nutritional intake and so forth. And they're also doing some genome-wide association studies, and that's to really look at the interplay between genetics as well as environmental factors and to see which of these factors will influence disease onset and progression. So I've talked a little bit there about the observational research that's been done with respect to looking at the influence of lifestyle factors on the onset and progression of Huntington's disease, but what studies are available for people living with Huntington's disease to look at? So when I first started in the Huntington's disease research field a little over 10 years ago, there was only a handful of studies that were looking at lifestyle-based approaches or rehabilitation approaches for people living with Huntington's disease. However, this has significantly increased over the last 5 years, and there's some really good quality research that's starting to emerge that's showing the benefits of exercise and physical activity interventions, as well as other approaches like multidisciplinary rehabilitation and cognitive training, and even things like Dance Revolution and gameplay. I'm only going to touch on a few of the more, I suppose, robust areas, such as exercise and physical activity and multidisciplinary rehabilitation for the most part of this talk, but I really do suggest you have a look at some of these other studies, which I've just flicked up there. So getting on to physical activity and exercise studies, I just want to start by giving a definition of physical activity because it's often used interchangeably with exercise, and they're two very different terms and intervention approaches. So physical activity is any bodily movement that is produced by the skeletal muscles that results in energy expenditure. So this could be an example of physical activity could be you mowing the lawn, walking to work, running for the bus, playing a sport, or even engaging in structured exercise. And there have been some studies that have looked at physical activity interventions. I'm just going to talk about one here today. And this one is actually done by Professor Monica Buster and her team, and it's called EngageHD, and it was completed several years ago. And what this group of researchers did is they conducted a randomized controlled trial, and this basically means that they had a control group or a control intervention. They had an experimental intervention, and in this case, the experimental intervention was a physical activity intervention, and they delivered it as coaching, which was done by physical therapists as well as nurses and other exercise specialists. They also gave all participants a physical activity workbook, which really focused on co-designed goals for exercise. So trying to fit exercise in a meaningful way into people's lives, because we often know it's quite challenging. And then it also came with a exercise DVD, and they compared that against social contact, because we know that social contact sometimes can have quite a positive effect on some aspects of certain diseases, including Huntington's disease. Now, the coaching itself was delivered across 6 sessions, and it was over a 14-week period, this study. And following the study, they saw improvements in an aspect of cognition called processing speed. And it was, in particular, it was on a test called the Symbol Digit Modalities Test, which many of you who are involved in Enroll HD would have actually done previously. They also saw increases in physical activity levels. They saw an improvement in the proficiency of people to actually engage in exercise in a meaningful way. So people felt confident doing exercise, and they also saw an improvement in their life space, meaning they were getting out more and engaging socially and getting outside of the house. So over to exercise, and this is something that I'm particularly interested in, and I've done a lot of it with my work with people with Huntington's disease as well as with athletes. So exercise is a physical activity that is planned, structured, and repetitive, and there's multiple types or forms of exercise that we can do, such as cardiovascular training, resistance training, flexibility and mobility, and neuromotor training. And I'm just going to cover these briefly to give you a bit of an understanding of each of these. So cardiovascular training could be that long, slow distance running that you would do, such as like a jog or a brisk walk. And then you've got interval training. Now, this is a really interesting area because there's actually really kind of around 3 types. So there's a pace tempo interval training where, say, if you were running a race, you'd be exercising at that level or maybe a little bit higher. There's what we call high intensity interval training, which has actually received a lot of attention recently. And high intensity interval training is basically people exercising at around 80% of their heart rate maximum or predicted heart rate maximum. And this is a style of training which is where you have a high intensity exercise bout by a period of recovery that may be passive or active. And the final one, which hasn't really made its way to the clinical areas, is called sprint interval training, which is actually really, really, really high. And we typically use it with athletes. And it's what we call about a sort of above a VO2 max test, which is basically a measure of our aerobic fitness. Resistance training, we usually break it down into muscular endurance training, muscular hypertrophy training, which is basically building up of the muscles, muscular strength training, and muscular power training. Range of motion is quite common in a lot of programs and can be done with things like yoga. And finally, a lot of the work that has been done in HD field has looked at gait, balance, and agility training, and it's incorporated into many interventions. So once again, I'm just going to talk about one study here because we don't have a lot of time, but this is probably the most robust study on exercise to date, and it was done by Laurie Quinn and her colleagues, and it was a randomized control trial. It involved 32 participants across 5 study sites in Europe. The researchers here looked at multimodal exercise and compared it to usual care. And their multimodal exercise intervention incorporated aerobic exercise, which was done on stationary bikes. And it was between about 65 to 85% of their age predicted maximum heart rate. So really kind of moderate intensity exercise. It also included strength training, and a lot of this was body weight exercises, and occasionally they had some assistive sort of weights, whether it be dumbbells or they had some TheraBands, and they did a lot of exercises such as squats and lunges and planks. And they did this for 3 sessions per week for 12 weeks. And following this intervention, they saw improvements in fitness, in particular in this VO2 max test, which is this maximal aerobic capacity. And they also saw an improvement on the UHDRS, particularly the motor score component, where they saw a reduction in this motor score value. That's a really important point, and the researchers I know in this study actually felt that improvement on the motor score component of the UHDRS may have been linked to positive changes within the brain, which has been shown in other exercise studies in other clinical populations, but needs a little bit more work. I'm going to briefly talk to you about their recently completed trial, which was called PACE-HD. This was a randomized controlled trial that compared exercise and physical activity to usual activity. It involved the recruitment of 120 people across European and US sites. And it aimed to actually look at the feasibility of the exercise and physical activity intervention, and also assess its effects on things such as fitness, physical activity levels, dual tasking, motor and cognitive function. And I suppose one of the nice aspects of this study is that it used the Enroll-HD platform, which a lot of people are involved in, and Leora and Rachel discussed a little bit earlier. And it had a randomization approach where 60 people who actually entered the study were randomized to the intervention group or the usual care group, but the other 60 people went into a sort of a natural history study as part of the Enroll-HD study. And there's no results at the moment, but we expect to see the results coming out very, very shortly. So it's kind of a watch this space for the PACE-HD study. So this kind of brings us to this question about what type of exercise is most beneficial and what dose of exercise. And when I'm talking about dose, I'm talking about intensity, volume, and frequency is most beneficial. And I always like to use this slide because while we've had significant progress in terms of the number of studies and the number of research teams that are starting to look at exercise and physical activity interventions, we're really only just out of our infancy in this area. There's a lot of other areas that are far more advanced, like the clinical cancer space is far more advanced here. And at this stage, we can't actually give you an optimal exercise regime because not enough work has been done. But in saying that, it's likely going to be individual. So based on a specific, the specific requirements of the individual. So based on their genetic makeup, based on their personal circumstances, working and other factors like that. But what we can tell you, similar to the World Health Organization guidelines, that you should be doing 150 minutes of moderate intensity exercise per week. And you can either break that up over 5 days or 3 days. You can break it up into 10-minute blocks, multiple times per day. You should be doing resistance exercise 2 to 3 times per week. And we know that this is really, really good for maintaining your muscles, your bone structures, and maintaining sort of a healthy weight. And you should be incorporating things such as yoga into your weekly exercise regimes. Now I'm going to get on to multidisciplinary rehabilitation, which is a little bit closer to what I actually are working currently. I'm going to start with some of the work that has been done in Europe, which is inpatient multidisciplinary rehabilitation. And they have these fantastic inpatient facilities in Norway, in the Netherlands, and in Italy, where they have a variety of allied healthcare specialists, so speech pathologists and exercise physiologists and physiotherapists and psychologists and so on. And people actually in these studies have gone into these inpatient facilities 3 times per year for a period of 3 weeks. And they've actually undertaken 5 days of intensive rehabilitation where they're going to receive exercise training, cognitive training, psychological counseling, nutritional counseling, and so on. And these teams have actually shown that this type of rehabilitation actually has quite a meaningful impact on the ability of people to walk. So they've seen an improvement in people's capacity to walk over a 6-minute period. They've seen improvements in balance, they've seen improvements in quality of life, and they've seen improvements in mood. It's a fantastic model. And unfortunately, while it's a great model, we can't really replicate it here, at least in Australia. We don't have a lot of these great inpatient rehabilitation facilities, particularly where I am in Perth. So what my team has done with our work is we've actually looked at outpatient multidisciplinary rehabilitation, and we've run 2 trials to date. They've been small, and they've also had feasibility components where there's only been one group, and that's the intervention group. But I'll describe the first study. It was a 9-month study where we got people with manifest Huntington's disease. So these are people who have symptoms of the disease, and they're between the early and moderate stages of the disease. And we got them to come into the gym and also to do exercises at home 3 times a week. And they also received fortnightly cognitive training. We assessed them on a variety of different tasks. So they did some imaging, they did some cognitive assessments, mood assessments, motor assessments. And following that study, we observed improvements in one aspect of memory. We saw improvements in lower limb muscle strength, which is to be expected with a resistance training regimen as well. We saw an improvement in muscle mass, which I suppose was an interesting finding because there wasn't a high volume study, and people also showed problems with muscle atrophy with Huntington's disease. So that was a nice finding, and improvement in manual dexterity. And finally, and I should caution you on this last finding because we only had one group, which was the intervention group, so no control group. But we saw an increase in grey matter volume in areas of the brain that normally degenerate, so the caudate nucleus and the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, and that these increases in grey matter volume in these areas were actually associated with memory outcomes. This is our more recent study. This was done in people with pre-manifest Huntington's disease. This was an allocated control trial. It was run in Perth and Melbourne with our collaborators over there. So Professor Nelly Giorgio Christianis, who's always been a very nice collaborator of ours. It was a 9-month study again, but this time we really worked on revising the intervention that we were applying. So this one actually had computerized cognitive training, and it had what we call periodized aerobic and resistance training. And periodization is basically the planned delivery of exercise, and it's with the aim of specifically targeting certain energy systems to basically maximize improvements gained from exercise. And we did a process called auto-regulation as well, which basically means that if people were coming in and not feeling really motivated for the session, or they're a little bit tired, or they're a little bit fatigued, that we would run a reduced volume and intensity session, and then we would build it up a little bit further down the track. This intervention also had a dual tasking component, and it had social events built into it and sleep and nutritional guidelines. It was very intensive, and we're so thankful to all of our participants who are involved in this. And I think because it was a very nice study in terms of great camaraderie, we saw that 87% of the people who are involved actually adhered to the sessions with an 85% compliance rate. And I think this is what we're looking at when we're looking at non-pharmaceutical interventions, is how many people complied with the training. So this is how many people did the prescribed training that you were giving them. And following the study, we saw that people who were in the intervention group, so this multidisciplinary rehabilitation group, actually had a reduced rate of volume loss in the caudate nucleus and the putamen compared to the usual care group. They showed an improvement in verbal learning and memory. They showed a preservation of brain-derived neurotrophic factor levels, and this protein is involved in kind of supporting neuronal systems, so nerve cells. And we also saw an increase in the percentage of time that people spent in what we call rapid eye movement sleep, which is a fundamental aspect of sleep that normally deteriorates in people with Huntington's disease. Okay, I'm going to quickly describe a study that we're scheduled to run soon. This is a randomized controlled trial. We were originally looking to actually enroll 100 participants, and it was going to be a multi-site trial, but it's been severely impacted by COVID. We were going to run it within the gym environment. We've since revised this, so it's going to be a telehealth delivered intervention. So we delivered home-based. It will have the periodized auto-regulated multimodal exercise training that we've done previously, so aerobic and resistance exercises, and we've also built in some balance and gait sort of exercises. It will have computerized cognitive training, which will focus on multiple aspects of cognition, and it will include a therapist-led sleep health guidance program. And we're going to compare this not against usual care, we're going to actually compare this against a lifestyle coaching program where we actually prescribe currently recommended physical activity guidelines, cognitively stimulating activities. So it's not actually a control group, it's just a comparison between two interventions. And we're really interested to see whether these interventions are feasible for people living with Huntington's disease and whether they can have a positive effect on cognition, sleep, mood, and quality of life. Okay, so I want to discuss where I see the future of non-pharmaceutical therapies, and these are just entirely my own viewpoint, and I've only covered a few of them here just in the interest of time. So computerized cognitive training is one area which I think that it really should be pursued in the area of Huntington's disease. We've seen a couple of feasibility studies come out, and there's been another study which I don't actually have here that was done by Julie's team. And basically, we know that it's feasible, and we know that it can have a positive effect on some aspects of cognition. It's been very, very beneficial in other conditions such as Parkinson's disease in older adults and people who are at risk of Alzheimer's disease. So it's something that I think that we can progress forward. Another one is respiratory muscle training. This is some work that's been done by our team, in particular by a researcher called Dr. Avro Reyes, and it's also been done in Cardiff by Dr. Una Jones. And respiratory complications are quite apparent in the latter stages of Huntington's disease. And these feasibility studies that have previously been conducted have shown that respiratory muscle training, inspiratory and expiratory, can improve the inspiratory and expiratory muscle function and can also improve a little bit of swallow function as well. So we really should be trying to progress these up to a randomized controlled trial and out of that feasibility stage. Something that we're really interested in, and a postdoc from my group is currently pursuing this area, is looking at the effects of light therapy to combat sleep and fatigue issues. We currently have a number of trials that are running in people with MS and stroke and Parkinson's disease, but we are developing a trial now for people with Huntington's disease, and this will be a randomized controlled trial. It will involve green blue light therapy with the glasses that you can see on the right-hand side, in addition to sleep hygiene. It will be compared to sleep hygiene alone. And we're going to be asking participants to do this for 4 weeks, and they'll be undertaking the light therapy for 60 minutes in the morning. And we're just looking at feasibility predominantly, and then having a look at some secondary outcomes such as sleep health, fatigue, mood, and quality of life. Dual task training is another really sort of interesting area, and some people are pursuing it. It's being done in Parkinson's disease thus far, and we know that over time, people with Huntington's disease have greater difficulty multitasking. And we know that that's linked to the pathological changes that occur in the brain, particularly in the striatum. And there's a bit of a theory that if we can combine cognitive and exercise training together, that it might actually be more effective than cognitive and exercise training done separately, and may actually incur greater neurological benefits, because it's actually it's taking up greater neurological resources within the brain. But certainly an area that we should be having a look at in the future, and our team will be looking at this a little bit closer. Something that I'm very interested in, and it's not often discussed. There's a lot of, I suppose, chatter about exercise as medicine, but I think that we should really be looking at sport as medicine. And I've been a coach for a very long period of time, and I think that it's got all the elements of a great intervention. It's got the cognitive elements, it's got the motor elements, it's got the social aspects. It's usually constantly dual tasking. People tend to enjoy it. And so some of the work that we're doing at the moment is we're looking at boxing for Parkinson's disease, but there's been other studies in Parkinson's disease as well as MS looking at the benefits of dancing, and with some really promising preliminary findings. So this is something that I think that would be really beneficial for people with Huntington's disease, and in the future. Finally, just to wrap up, I'd like to thank all the HD families for participating in our research studies. There's without a doubt that we couldn't do this work without you, and our people are just phenomenal, particularly in WA. They're really inspiring. I'd like to thank Huntington's WA and the WA Neurosciences Unit. They are so helpful for us. They help us with our studies. They're always caring. My team, Danielle Bartlett and Mitchell Turner, who do a lot of work behind the scenes, and our collaborators, particularly our Australian collaborators. When I started in the field of Huntington's disease, I didn't come from a Huntington's disease lab, and I had to ask a lot of questions and about the field, and these people helped me a lot. So this is Nelly Georgia, Christiana, Anthony Hannon, Julie Stout, who you'll hear from in a second, and Anna Lampert is a little bit of a side one. And finally, our funders, Huntington's WA, Perpetual Living Lottery West, and MSWA. Here's our references, and we are available anytime to have a chat. So flick me an email, have a look at the stuff that we're doing, and we're more than happy to help with exercise or cognitive training questions or any of the work that we're doing with sleep. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Travis, for that really excellent presentation. And I know I speak on behalf of everybody watching this evening that the quality of our presentations has been absolutely superb.